Good, Good morning. I think, yeah, that sounds about right. Well, follow that. I obviously can't. Firstly, thanks very much to the organisers for giving me an opportunity to say a bit about my bit of the standards world. And it's been a while, I think, since there's been a sort of formal update of what SC34 is up to. And a few of you won't even probably know who we are, while some of you, of course, have known for a long time. A bit about me to start with. I'm a publishing technology consultant, and I've been involved with XML and before that with SGML since the mid-1980s. And so I'm passionate about the technology and the fact that they're standards. And I've employed them in a variety of ways in the publishing industry over that time, and still do. Some of you may have heard of me in the context of other standards work, such as Onyx in the publishing industry. The title of my brief presentation is slightly rhetorical. Does the world need more XML standards? I mean, who knows? But if there are going to be any, they're going to be talked about here, is my feeling. So, for those of you who don't know who SC34 are, I better explain this awful long acronym for the name of our committee. So, ISO what? Well, ISO is the International Standards Organization, and IEC, which you'll have seen in the long acronym, is another standards body called the International Electrotechnical Commission. And together, back in the late 1980s, they joined forces to create a single joint technical committee for doing ICT standardization. Whether that was a good idea or not, people will no doubt continue to argue about, but that is what they did. And from then on, most of the ICT standardization that's gone on at the sort of formal international level has been within this joint technical committee. So SC34, just one of 22 subcommittees of JTC1, and we have a particular brief on document description and processing languages, which is obviously a very small niche in the overall picture of what JTC1 does. Now, George mentioned the figure 20, and of course, so it's perhaps appropriate that I mention some anniversaries as well. It's about 50 years since this whole idea of markup started to be articulated publicly. The sources that I've looked at suggest that it was back in 1967, so just over 50 years ago, that Bill Tunnicliffe started talking about separating document content from form. And that idea was fairly quickly picked up by others, probably independently of that. So people like Charles Goldfarb, who then went on to actually create SGML, started looking at this around in those late 60s, and by 1969 they already had plans of a product based upon the ideas of SGML, what became SGML. And then throughout the 70s there was mostly activity in the States, which led to IBM backing the technology, at least in the form of GML in 1973. And in 1978, Goldfarb produced a full user guide to GML, and that was really the basis of the SGML standard that was eventually produced. So it took quite a lot of political lobbying to get SGML off the ground as an international standard. I first heard of SGML, in fact, in 1982, because Goldfarb and others came to Europe to talk about SGML and to try and drum up support for the idea of SGML as an international standard at a time when they were struggling to get it accepted in the North American standards space. And they thought they might have more luck with getting it standardized in Europe or internationally. In the States, SGML first appeared as a published standard in 1983. In 1984, finally, Goldfarb and others managed to persuade everybody to be on side to form a standards committee that would develop SGML as an international standard, and in 1986 it came out. And then a year later, the US Department of Defense became its first major user with military standard adopting SGML. We then quickly went into a sort of seismic time in which, for standards making, in which the PC revolution and then the internet revolution sort of overturned the whole world of ICT. And so you have a series of events throughout the early 90s which really disrupted the standards making process so far as the international standards world was concerned, with the IETF being formed in 93, World Wide Web Consortium in 94, and eventually, by the latter part of the 90s, ISO and IEC had to rethink the way they were producing international standards and had reorganized JTC1. And as part of that, the working group that had originally created SGML was reformed as SC34. SGML was, you could argue, a kind of one-horse wonder for that group, although in fact it was part of a family of technologies that were originally proposed for standardization. And in the early 90s, the committee that became SC34 continued to work on those standards, and one or two others in the sort of document description processing world. So we had things like standard page description language, more significantly in 96, DSL, document style and semantic specification language, which had been part of the original proposals that had been put forward in 1984, and then High Time in 97. But it was, in a sense, becoming less relevant to many people because the World Wide Web Consortium and the Internet Engineering Task Force had sort of grasped the initiative in terms of the sort of style of standardization and the method and speed with which they could get specifications out. So SC34 became perhaps a little bit of a backwater in comparison, in public terms anyway. Early in 2000s, SC34 might have disappeared if it weren't for the fact that there were some major projects that we got involved with, and the first of those was topic maps. That had actually started in the 90s as a result of work on High Time, and there was a very energetic group within SC34. They had their own working group, met loads of experts, and produced lots of specifications. Although towards the end of that process, it did rather, the experts drifted away and it took longer and longer to get the standards out. So the last of those was not published until 2015. And the other project that was important to SC34 in those early 2000s was the group of standards for schema languages known as Document Schema Definition Languages, or DSDL. And most important in that group were Relaxing and Schematron, which we hit with Schematron we've heard quite a lot about this week. But others have become part of the canon, NVDL in particular. And CREPDL has also been standardized and is used in various contexts. I'll mention in passing Schema Association, Part 11, which was a relatively late entry in which SC34 collaborated with W3C on producing the small but significant specification of how to attach schemas to documents using XML model processing instruction. Probably the way in which most people have heard of SC34 was its association with Office document file formats. And in 2006, we had ODF being presented to us, and SC34 had very little to do with the process of actually acquiring these standards. This was JTC1 was asked to standardize this by OASIS, and then it was handed over to SC34 as more or less a fait accompli. And ever since then, we've been working with OASIS on maintenance of the ISO version of ODF. And similarly, we then were faced with the Microsoft Office file formats, XML in 2008, decision at a higher level to adopt this, and then who was going to maintain it. And we have been putting an enormous amount of effort into maintaining that specification ever since. More recent work has been on particular related to epub. We started discussions back in 2012, I think it was, with IDPF on publishing epub. what was hoped would eventually lead to epub 3 being published as a standard. It wasn't at that point deemed to be sufficiently stable, so it was published as a technical specification, but events since then have rather moved on with the merger of IDPF and W3C, and now we're in a sort of a period of just working out whether and how epub 3 might be standardized within the formal standardization process in ISO. And then there are some various other standards we've been working on. A standard profile for zip, which hasn't yet been implemented, but which is there to enable other standards to formally specify the use of zip in those standards for packaging documents. And of course, we've heard quite a lot about schematron this week. Overall structure these days of working group of SC34 is in 4 working groups. One concerned with maintenance of XML, Microsoft Office file formats. That's led by Dr. Makoto Murata, who many of you will know in various contexts. WG6, which is convened by myself, managing the relationship with OASIS. JWG7, which is the epub working group, which we share with several other interested parties. That's quite a sort of big collaborative project. And working group 8 is a kind of tidying up everything else kind of working group where we manage maintenance of the DSDL standards, including schematron. And Andrew Sales is the project editor on that, as you know. And Krepdel is in that group as well. So what about the future? Well, that's why I asked the question, do we need more XML standards? Really, it's, do we need any more XML standards from SC34? I've just taken over as chair of SC34, and I want to work out in my first year whether there's a future for us as a standards-making body. And there is a future for us, but only if people and the market demands formal international standards in this area. So we are actively looking to see what might become standards in the future, but we're dependent on people like you to tell us that you need additional standards and you need us to be involved in that process. Of course, you have a choice. We realize that the W3C and OASIS still very actively involved in producing standards in their own way, and we respect that and we work with them. We are there too, and we'll try to stay engaged with you in future events of this kind so that you have the opportunity to bring your ideas to us about possible future standards. This slide just contains a list of some of the things that we're currently thinking about. Do come and talk to me if you'd like more information. We need more standards, I think, for the reasons that I put on this slide. We need to improve the quality of implementations by ensuring consistency of implementation. And we need interoperability between those implementations. And that's necessary to protect users on the one hand, end users from poor quality, lack of interoperability and extra costs associated with that, and to protect implementers themselves from poorly defined specifications leading to increased costs and higher risks. And I think that international standards are needed and are valuable, otherwise I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, to promote equality of experience of standards across the world. We're not just interested in a bubble of technology development in certain parts of the world. We want to make sure that those standards are implementable wherever. And I would like to feel that in 10 years' time, if some developer in a country in Southern Africa wanted to implement one of our standards, that the specifications would enable them to do that. We have to be careful, of course, not to try and standardize too much and standardize things too trivially. They have to be seriously needed in the market. So I think I've spent long enough, and hopefully you will find time to ask me any questions that you have during the break.